The third time in 14 months that Beverly Crane blocked my garage with her Audi A4 during a Tuesday evening neighborhood gathering, I was not angry, I was finished. There is a difference between angry and finished that I want to be precise about because the difference shaped everything that followed. Angry produces reactive decisions. Finished produces deliberate ones. I had spent 14 months being patient and systematic and documented, and I had arrived at the specific clarity of someone who has exhausted every reasonable option and is now going to do the thing that should have been done earlier and is going to do it correctly. My name is Harriet Voss. I am 47 years old, a licensed civil engineer with 16 years of experience in site design, drainage infrastructure, and hardscape systems, and I have lived in the Pinecrest Commons HOA development in central Maryland for 5 years. My husband Daniel is a high school physics teacher. Our house is a 3-bedroom Cape Cod on a standard lot with a detached one-car garage at the rear of the property accessed by a concrete driveway running from Oak Street along the western side of the house to the garage, 41 feet long, 11 feet wide. The garage contained my truck, Daniel's cycling equipment, my workshop tools, and the chest freezer we relied on for the bulk food purchasing that was a meaningful component of our household budget management. Access to the garage was not decorative convenience, it was operational necessity. Beverly Crane lived directly across Oak Street. She was 58, recently retired from a career in financial services, and she drove an Audi A4 in a shade she called Glacier White that I could identify from a block away. Her property had a 2-car driveway and a street parking space directly in front of her house. When she hosted or attended the neighborhood gatherings that occurred regularly on our block, her driveway accommodated her Audi and her husband Philip's SUV without difficulty. The problem arose during gatherings at other houses when street parking filled and Beverly determined that the approach to my garage was an acceptable overflow position. The first incident had been in month 2 of my residence. I had come home from a late site visit to find the Audi blocking my garage and Beverly inside the gathering 3 houses down. I had knocked on the gathering host's door, reached Beverly, and she had moved the car with the warm apology that warm people make when they are caught doing something inconsiderate and have not yet decided whether to stop. The second incident had been in month 4. Same approach, same apology, same warmth, no change. By month 6, I had 5 documented incidents and had established through my doorbell camera and a second camera I had installed on the garage facing the driveway that Beverly's pattern was consistent with neighborhood social events and street parking occupancy. She was not parking randomly. She had incorporated my driveway as part of her parking strategy for social occasions. I will not detail every step of the 14 months because the sequence is familiar from every account in this collection. 4 direct conversations, 2 written notes, 1 HOA complaint producing a fine that Beverly paid without behavioral change, 1 attorney letter from my property lawyer Andrea Mills that Beverly described to Philip, who mentioned it to Daniel at a neighborhood barbecue, as unnecessary given the nature of the situation. The nature of the situation was 47 documented incidents. After the 47th incident, I called Andrea and told her I was moving to the structural solution. She said, "What are you designing?" I said, "Concrete pillars at the driveway entrance, permitted structure, standard residential access control application. I have been thinking about the design since month 8. She said, "Tell me the geometry." I said 2 pillars, 16 inches square, 40 inches tall, concrete masonry unit cores with rebar reinforcement. Brick veneer in the same bond pattern as the house foundation. Gate between the pillars, steel, padlocked. Positioned at the curb cut on my property side of the sidewalk so there is no right-of-way issue. She said, "Permit." I said, "Maryland residential driveway modification." I pulled the application in month 11 when I made the decision and received approval in 8 days. She said, "You pulled the permit in month 11." I said I wanted the permit in hand before I decided to proceed. Having the permit does not require construction. Not having the permit delays construction. She said, "You have been carrying an approved permit for 3 months." I said I was still working through the behavioral sequence. The permit was waiting. She said, build it. The legal basis is solid and the documentation record is complete. I ordered materials that week. Clay brick matched to my house foundation, which I had sampled and sent to a masonry supplier who confirmed the manufacturer and product line and had the correct stock. Concrete block for the cores, rebar, mortar. The gate hardware I had designed and fabricated myself over 2 weekends because I am an engineer and fabricating steel gate components is within my technical capability and I wanted the hardware to be mine. The gate was square tube steel, 1.5-inch wall, with a decorative flat bar infill I had designed on graph paper and cut on my shop chop saw. I had drilled the hinge pinholes with a drill press to tolerances that would produce smooth operation and had cold-blued the finished gate to a dark finish that matched the hardware on our front porch light fixtures. The padlock was a high-security cylinder lock of the type used in commercial applications, hardened steel shackle, with a key profile I had not seen in any hardware store in the county. I am a civil engineer, and I build things that are going to work correctly. Construction happened on a Saturday when Daniel was at a cycling event in Annapolis. I worked alone because the work was straightforward for someone with my background and because working alone on something like this produces a quality of attention that working with company does not. The footings had been poured the previous weekend and had cured for 7 days. The block coursework went up in 4 hours. The brick veneer went on in the afternoon. I finished the cap course and tooled the joints at 5 o'clock and stood back and assessed the installation. The brick bond pattern matched the house foundation. The mortar color was consistent. The pillars were plumbed to within 3/16 of an inch, which was within my acceptable tolerance for this application. The gate hung level on its fabricated hinges, the cold-blued finish catching the late afternoon light, and locked with the specific positive engagement of a high-security cylinder lock seated in correctly fitted hardware. I photographed the installation from 6 angles, from Oak Street, from my property interior, and from both sides of the gate. I filed the photographs with my permit documentation and sent a set to Andrea. She responded within an hour. She said, the brick matching is exact. I said I sampled the existing foundation and matched the manufacturer. She said civil engineering applied to brick selection. I said material specification is material specification. She said the gate is custom fabricated. I said I designed and built it. She said it looks professional. I said I am a professional. She sent a notification to the HOA management company that same afternoon, providing the permit number and a brief description of the installation. Rachel Bloom at the management company acknowledged it without issue. Daniel came home from Annapolis at 7 that evening. He rolled his bicycle past the new gate and stopped. He looked at the gate. He looked at the pillars. He looked at the brick. He said, "You matched the foundation." I said, "Sampled and matched." He said, "The gate is custom." I said, "Designed and fabricated." He walked around the western pillar, came to the interior side, looked at the structural grout showing at the top of the final block course before the cap, and said, "You reinforced the cores." I said, "Rebar at the corners and midspan on both pillars." He said, "For a driveway gate." I said, "For a permanent installation that I am building once and building correctly." He said, "How does it feel?" I said, "The brick is correct and the gate operates correctly. Everything is within specification." He said, "I meant emotionally." I said, "It feels like something that was going to happen eventually has happened at the correct time with the correct design and correct execution. That feels right." He said, "Beverly is going to see this tomorrow." I said, "Yes." He said, "We could be in Annapolis when she does." I said, "I have been wanting to see the waterfront." He said, "We could leave early." I said, "The cameras will record whatever happens." He looked at me with the expression he used when he was deciding whether to say something. He said, "You are a very specific kind of person, Harriet." I said, I am aware. He said, I am glad you are. We drove to Annapolis Sunday morning and spent the day at the waterfront and came home in the evening, and I reviewed the camera footage before I made dinner. Beverly's Audi had appeared at the driveway entrance at 9:47 Sunday morning. The street camera showed her pulling forward to her customary parking position and stopping when her front bumper was 3 inches from the eastern pillar. The footage showed the Audi sitting there for 5 minutes and 40 seconds. Then it reversed onto Oak Street and drove to Beverly's driveway 3 houses down. I watched the 5 minutes and 40 seconds twice, then I made dinner. Andrea filed the civil claim the following week. 47 incidents, the paid fine, the attorney letter, the installation costs, Andrea's fees for the full period, and compensatory damages. The total claim was $14,200. Beverly retained a local attorney named William Holt, who called Andrea within 10 days. His initial review of the documentation had apparently produced an honest conversation with Beverly about the exposure. His opening position was $9,000. Andrea said the demand was $14,200. He came back at $11,000. She said $13,000 was the floor. He accepted. $13,000. Beverly paid $8,000 personally. Her homeowner's insurance covered $5,000, the portion attributable to the documented property access incidents. The insurance adjuster who processed the claim called Andrea to ask about the documentation methodology and specifically about the camera system, coverage, and the incident log format. Andrea described it. The adjuster said it was the most thoroughly documented residential driveway access claim they had processed. Andrea called me after the settlement. She said $13,000 plus their own legal fees on top of that. I said good. She said the adjuster called about the documentation. I said, what did you tell him? She said, I told him my client is a civil engineer who documents everything. He said, that explained a great deal. I said, accurate. She said, are you satisfied with the outcome? I said the installation is correct and the settlement reflects the documented harm and the behavior has stopped. Those are the 3 outcomes I was working toward. She said, that is a very engineer answer. I said, it is also the true one. She said, how are you and Daniel? I said, we are going back to Annapolis next weekend. She laughed and ended the call. My neighbor to the north, a retired mechanical engineer named Frank Alderman, who had been on Pinecrest Commons for 9 years and who assessed construction the way engineers assess construction, which is to say with specific technical attention, came over the Monday after the settlement. He stood at the end of my driveway looking at the installation for 3 minutes without speaking. Then he said, the brick bond is consistent across both pillars and the cap course. I said, I laid the bond pattern before I started and checked it at every course. He said, the mortar joint width is consistent. I said, I use a consistent joint spacing tool. He said, the gate infill. I said, custom fabricated, flat bar at 6-inch intervals. He said, the cold blue finish. I said, applied after fabrication. He said, you did the metalwork yourself. I said, shop chop saw and drill press, 2 weekends. He looked at the lock. He said, high security cylinder. I said, commercial grade. He said, you overspecified this. I said, I specified it to the standard I hold for all my installations. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, Beverly is upset. I said, I know. He said, she told Miriam at the corner that you had built a fortress. I said, I built a driveway gate. He said, Miriam said it looked more like a monument. I said, it is a permitted residential access control structure that is correctly built from materials matched to the existing construction. He said, that is what I said. He looked at it one more time, then he said, I would have specified it the same way. I said, I know. He went home. I went inside and updated my documentation folder and filed the settlement paperwork and closed the active case record. The camera system continued to run. The gate continued to function. Beverly's Audi had not approached my driveway since the Sunday morning contact event. Daniel was at the kitchen table when I came in, grabbing lab reports. He looked up. He said, "Frank." I said he assessed the installation. He said he would have specified it the same way. Daniel said, "High praise from Frank." I said he is a mechanical engineer. He understands specification. Daniel said, "Is it over?" I said, "The settlement is paid, the installation is in place, the documentation is filed, and Beverly has not approached the driveway since the first contact event. By all available metrics, yes, it is over." He said, "How does it feel now?" I said the same way it felt before. Correct. The problem required a solution. The solution was designed and built correctly. The legal process produced the appropriate outcome. Everything is as it should be. He said, "You never got angry." I said, "I got finished. Those are different." He said, "I know. I have been watching for 14 months. He went back to his lab reports. I made tea and stood at the window looking at the driveway where the pillars stood at the curb cut in the fading light of the November afternoon, matched brick and consistent mortar joints, and a custom fabricated gate that hung level and locked correctly and would be there for as long as we owned this house, and probably longer. The solution was there. It had been built correctly. The problem was solved. That was the standard I held for everything I built, and it was sufficient, and it was always going to be sufficient when the design was correct, and the execution was correct, and the documentation was thorough, and the legal process was complete. The gate was closed. The driveway was mine. Everything was exactly as it should be. Thumbnail text, she blocked his garage 47 times. A civil engineer built a custom gate with matched brick and a commercial lock. The Audi found it on day one.